coming along to this session at ThinkTent, titled "Just How Big is the Quango State?" And we've got four excellent speakers to talk about this from different perspectives. We've got George Greenwood, a data journalist at the Times, and if you picked up the Times this morning, you'll have seen a spread in there where George has looked at the cost of quangos and the people who sit on multiple boards of quangos and all sorts of different things in between. So George is going to have some very good insights for us. We've got Nick Timothy, who of course was the former Chief of Staff to Theresa May and is a columnist at the Daily Telegraph. The Right Honourable Lord Maud of Horsham, who's a former Minister for the Cabinet Office, among many other things. And Dr. Catherine Haddon, a Senior Fellow for the Institute of Government. We've only got an hour. We tried to squeeze as much in as we can, so, you know, I won't give too much of a framer. I'll just get us going, really. The Quango State, it often seems, you know, quite distant from most ordinary voters, but, you know, a lot of people also say to have power out of the hands of central government can be a good thing also. So hopefully lots to discuss. I'll hand straight to George to get us going.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. Look, we all, you know, we study students of history. We are aware of, you know, the bonfire of the Quangos being one of the big policies of the coalition. You know, we go from having a very large number of disparate alphabet soup organisations, and over the sort of 5 years of the coalition and after, there was a really big effort to try and sort of bring that thicket down. The problem is that the sort of money eyes gone off the ball a bit. So my reporting from today's paper looked at the fact that spending had creeped up again to almost the level it was in sort of 2012. There's another issue as well in terms of what we define as quangos. The Cabinet Office will tell you that we have dropped the number of quangos by 2/3 since 2009. Well, actually, if you look at the ONS data, which classifies government bodies for public accounts by whether they are a central government department or a local government department, you've got the number of quangos has only gone down from about 1,000 to 800 in that period. And actually, in the last 2 years, it's gone up, you know, from not huge amounts, but it's, you know, going the other way again. So it does bring a question to how do you govern, you know, this a wide array of bodies, you know, some incredibly important regulators that really keep us safe from problems going wrong, and how do we do that from the centre? The National Audit Office did a very, very interesting report back in July on exactly this problem, and what they found was often you just don't have data at the centre for any sort of overall analysis of how a quango is performing. You don't have the right sort of benchmarking. You can't, as a senior civil servant or a minister, go in and say, okay, how is Natural England doing this year? Well, you know, we can talk to them. We don't have figures to talk about that. We also have a problem of often problems in government are moved off into quangos. So as part of the Brexit arrangements, you know, we have a number of new bodies coming in, things like the Office of Environmental Protection, for example. And I wonder, you know, if there's enough thought being given into how you, when you reshore those powers, you know, whether you do that within departments themselves. And that was another thing the NA report looked at, was the fact that when you're setting up these new government bodies, often you don't go and do an analysis process saying, do we really need another one? Often it's just, okay, this is the easiest way of doing it, we'll just throw it out into a quango. And so, you know, one of the big regulatory issues in all of this is how you govern and manage quango performance from the centre. There's also an issue of governance. Quangos are not necessarily the places where, you know, people like me are digging through every day, holding them accountable. And that can lead to things like executive salaries which are questionable, especially for part-time work for non-executive directors, as the story looked at today. But it also comes down to, you know, how you actually ensure you're getting the most for your performance from those staff. I mean, I found examples of quango chiefs who've got second jobs. You know, they're some of the highest paid public servants who often regulate quite important things. You know, the chair of the chief executive of Homes England, for example, you know, as a side gig advising a big private equity firm. Now, you know, I'm all for bringing expert advice in and have people who've got, you know, market experience, things like that. But you have to question how much, you know, time you've got as somebody on £200,000-300,000 a year to do other things as well. And I think, you know, we wouldn't accept it for ministers, so there has to be sort of some proper accountability for the top of these, you know, bodies who perform, you know, often very important roles, because that's exactly what they're doing. There's also an issue of public appointments. Now, there was a lot of fuss back in February around Lord Wharton's appointment at the Office of Students. Now, you know, he's obviously had a very, good experience in government, but he didn't actually have much experience in higher education. Of course, he was Boris Johnson's campaign manager. Now, this is not, this is happening to some extent in this government more, and we are seeing, delays to public appointments, and people who maybe aren't the best necessarily for the job if you had a completely open process. And that's bad for the quangos, the area of quangos. We need people who are experts. We need people who have experience in the right areas. And certainly something Peter Riddell has looked at as Commissioner of Public Appointments. So we need a more transparent, system for selecting non-executive directors, panel members, and chief executives for our quangos. Both for public taxpayer, spending of money, and also for governance to make sure those bodies are operating correctly. I think that's probably
Okay. Yeah, thank you, George. Nick, I'm going to pass straight to you for your opening remarks.
Okay, thank you. I want to start off with something that might be foolish for a Taxpayers Alliance event, which is to make a confession, for I am a quangocrat. I sit on the organising committee of the Commonwealth Games and the board of the Sports Rescue Package, which helps community sports clubs through the pandemic. And the salaries, the bonuses, the government cars, the jollies. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any of it. They're completely unpaid positions. Quangos are necessary, or at least something like them, however you define them. We need operational organisations that are capable of delivering outside the day-to-day work of departments. We shouldn't want civil servants trying to run something like the Commonwealth Games. In my experience of working inside government departments, I don't think they'd go very well. But with the kind of the sums of public money that these things involve, we do need these organisations to be public bodies that are in some way accountable to ministers. And I would think the same could be said for the British Council or the Care Quality Commission or any of those kinds of organisations. But I'm not actually here to defend quangos, because many of them don't work in the way that they should. And I think I'd like to hear some from Francis. I imagine they're better stories than me, but after 5 years in the Home Office, I can share some horror stories of some of the quangos. My favourite was the UK Border Agency, which was created because John Reid, on becoming Home Secretary, realised that problems in the immigration system was what cost Home Secretaries their job. So he created this independent body, shoved it as far away from him as possible, and said it was independent. And when we got into the Home Office in 2010, we found an organisation that, apart from the fact that it had its own press office and strategy unit and all of these different things, it was lurching from crisis to crisis. And was engaged in what the officials used to call 5-year-olds football, where everyone just chased the ball and forgot about the things over there. We discovered that the border force had been suspending security checks at the border without authorisation in order to avoid queues at airports and ports, and that had been going on for several years under both governments. I remember Damien Green, as Immigration Minister, discovered something he wasn't very happy about. I think it was probably a backlog of some kind in the media, and when he said to the senior official from UKBA, how did I not know about this? What is going on? The senior official replied, "But Minister, it's my job to protect you from information like that." Which sounds like something from Yes Minister, but is actually, I think, a mentality that you sometimes find in these organisations. So we do need them, but they need to be obviously effective, they need to be accountable, and we need to be clear that they're not there to make political decisions, to make policies that are best decided by elected politicians. And I think you can think of several quangos that actually fail these tests. You've got organisations like the National Trust, the Electoral Commission, wading into political issues. It's not necessarily the fault of the committee. I would actually partly blame Parliament, but the Climate Change Committee, not content with its statutory remit, recently announced it was, and I will read the quote, looking to, quote, broaden its outlook and, quote, judge the equitable distribution of the costs and benefits of policy. which I would say is a matter for Parliament and not for a single issue committee. And then we have many others which I'm sure we will end up talking about. So what to do? Well, I think ministers need to make, and this should be a kind of ongoing process, an assessment of what needs to be done, by whom and where. There is a review taking place. We'll see how that goes. But ministers should be proactive and I think quite forceful in their departments in trying to work out where responsibilities sit. So we ended up breaking up the UK Borders Agency and putting its different commands into the Home Office so they were directly accountable to ministers, something that was considered to be very brave by officials. But you can bring them into departments, you can create things that actually aren't state bodies sometimes, with social enterprises, charities, completely independent institutions. For those that remain, there needs to be proper accountability, so more accountability to ministers, but also to Parliament. And if ministers are to play a stronger role in holding these organisations to account, there needs to be civil service reform too, so that ministers have more heft around them to get some of that work done. And then thirdly, and this is my last point, on the political behaviour of quangos, it's sometimes said that this only really happens because these organisations are dominated by sort of lefties, like the sort of New Labour deep state. And there's a little bit of truth in that. There's quite a lot of lefties in these organisations, but there's a lot of conservatives too, and that doesn't mean that the behaviour changes. And I think partly this is cultural, and ministers need to be clear about what is the responsibility of a department, what is the responsibility of Parliament, what's the responsibility of a quango. But actually, this is often down to the legal frameworks that Parliament itself has set. So I would say that the Climate Change Committee has been given too much freedom to decide things that are rightly the decisions of ministers and Parliament. But I think a lot of these organisations are operating within legal frameworks from the Blair and Brown era, the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, where if you look at the sort of legal tests that and the legal duties that those legal frameworks place on organisations, equality impact assessments, I think they're not actually compulsory, but they're taken to be compulsory for meeting the public sector equality duty. Different requirements under the Human Rights Act. You think about all the different things that parts of the state have to do before they think about actually then doing their job. It's no wonder, I think, that the way they do their job is then completely influenced by those duties, and it would be brave and it would be controversial, but I think the government would need to look at those legal frameworks as well.
Nick, thank you very much. We'll pass over to Lord Maud without further ado.
Great. Well, I totally agree with what Nick said, and thank you to George for the work in actually looking and analysing the data and trying to make sense of it and trying to reconcile different sets of data, which is, we all know in government, the quality of data is generally not very good, and this is not unique to the UK. I now work with governments in a number of countries, and the quality of data, wherever you look, is dodgy. And the title of this session is just how big is the quango state? Well, generally the government itself doesn't know that. Before the 2010 election, when we were looking at quangos, we reckoned we in the opposition knew more than the government did about the number of quangos. We thought there were probably around 900. It turned out to be broadly right. I never, when we were conducting this review, never used the phrase bonfire of the quangos, because I'd seen when previous governments had used that phrase and it generally kind of fizzled out. But we did say we were going to do a CAL, we were going to do a proper rigorous review and apply some tests. And Nick's covered some of this, but the first question is, does this activity need to be done at all? And some of it didn't. Governments are notoriously bad at turning things off that are no longer, even if they were needed at some stage, quite often they've become redundant or obsolete. And governments are really bad at dismantling things. They just kind of carry on with their own momentum. If yes, it is something that needs to be done, does it need to be done by the state? and we found that some of the things that were being done by quangos didn't. So, for example, we pushed out of government what became the Rivers and Canals Trust, which had been, I think, the Inland Waterways Authority or Board. And it then became a membership organization, a social enterprise, and it's encouraged huge numbers, it's attracted huge numbers of volunteers and members, and has actually led to a revival of interest and engagement and participation in these incredibly important assets. And so it doesn't, same with English Heritage, which was running a huge number of heritage assets, and we pushed that out to become, again, a charity outside government, which again has attracted much more interest and support. But if it does have to be done by the state, then why can't it be done in-house in a way that is accountable to ministers? And the concern that we had was, yes, we wanted to save money in this review, and we did. I'll come on to that in a moment. But actually the bigger question was the democratic deficit of activities being conducted by organizations which had no element of democratic accountability. They weren't accountable to ministers, who of course are themselves accountable to Parliament. And some of the result of the review was some of the activities were brought inside government departments and made directly accountable, and remedying some of that democratic deficit. But if the tests we applied to that were, there were some things which are regulators, and which do need to be seen to operate independently of ministers, and they need to be operationally independent of politics. Some of these activities are to do with measuring or establishing facts in an independent way, which again sometimes needs to be done in a non-accountable quango. We had a third category, which was, does it perform a purely technical function? And that never really made sense, but I think we came up with it to accommodate some things we just didn't want to do. And often you'll find some of these tests are kind of reverse engineered to fit your preconceptions, and I would abandon that. And we had this interesting experience introducing, and Nick will remember this, the public, and Catherine as well, the Public Bodies Bill in 2010. And when legislation's introduced, you go through a process of working out what's going to be less controversial, so we can introduce those bills in the House of Lords. And the controversial things have to go through the House of Commons first. And we made the mistake of thinking that this didn't look very controversial. And we got that. That was a very, very big mistake, because we introduced it in the House of Lords, and it ran into trouble immediately, because there was, in order to actually effect the reduction in the number of quangos and to do the mergers that were important to take out duplicated cost and to bring things in-house and to push things out, we said we want some secondary legislation powers, or what are known colloquially as Henry VIII clauses. And the House of Lords didn't like this at all. And what we discovered was very quickly, and I'm obviously very fond of the House of Lords, I'm now a member of it, we've discovered very many peers, mostly, I have to say, conservative peers, who would come up to me and say, Francis, we completely agree with what you're trying to do. The principle of it is excellent, but you couldn't possibly mean this particular public body, of which I happen to be a member of the board. And so, really annoyingly, we ended up having to dilute some of the ways in which we were going to operate this. Whereas, when this bill went to the House of Commons, it went through like a hot knife through butter, because actually members of Parliament, members of the House of Commons, could see the point and see how valuable this was, and they were relishing the idea of more of these activities, A, saving money they thought was good, and B, more of these activities being accountable to them. And so we should have done it the other way around, and it would have been more effective. But We did significantly reduce the number of quangos through a combination of pushing out, disbanding, merging to cut costs, and bringing some things in-house. And we did save significant amounts of money, something like £2.6 billion. Yes, it all adds up. And we put in place triennial reviews. We said that it isn't enough just to do this as a one-off activity every so often. Every continuing quango should be subjected to a review every 3 years to put it through all of those tests again. And I slightly knew with a sinking feeling as we were doing this that this would happen, it would be done, but the rigor with which it would be done would diminish over time. And I'm sure there have been some quangos which have been abolished or significantly reduced in scale since, but I've got to say I'm not aware of any. So if anyone's aware of some, I would be thrilled to hear of it, but I'm not holding my breath on that one. The final point is on, to pick up the point Nick made about public appointments to the boards of public bodies, which is a really important thing. And there was no doubt that this was a process. It's really hard. A lot of processes had been loaded onto this to make it really hard for ministers to put in place the people they wanted. Panels, which tended to be principally assembled by civil servants and then staffed by civil servants, candidate specifications, which tended excessively to focus on the track record. So basically, to get appointed onto a public body board, you had to show that you had a track record of doing exactly that already, which meant that it actually disproportionately disadvantaged women and people from ethnic minorities. And so actually we had a proposal we wanted to increase the diversity, not out of top box ticking or filling quotas, but actually because if you're excluding, actually more than half of the available talent, you're not doing yourself a service. And so changing the way candidate specifications were being drawn up and the job descriptions, to have much more focus on what's your capability, not just what's your track record. We did actually increase the number of women who were being appointed very dramatically to very close to the 50%, which was our aim, without deliberately skewing it at all, but just by opening up to all the talent that there was. But you could find, and you needed to. I mean, speaking obviously very privately in this closely contained room, you needed to make sure that the candidates you wanted to get appointed knew how to go through the process, because there is a way of making sure you do tick all the boxes, and we needed to help people with that. And so we did something. We did a lot of outreach. We went out, and then candidates who hadn't been interested because they kind of hadn't thought this was for them, we went out and found them, and then we supported them and to work out how to do it. It meant ministers had to take much more seriously than they were doing the reviews of the job descriptions and the candidate specifications. I fell down on this immediately, and then when the candidate I wanted, who was superbly qualified for the role, fell at the first hurdle, I simply said, okay, we're going to stop this and we're going to rerun it. And then I just made sure we were on all of the detail. And that's what you have to do. Otherwise, what you get is exactly what Nick has described, which is the same people being kind of circulated around again and again and again. A groupthink dominates, and what you need is new people with new ideas who are tough enough and independent enough to challenge the received wisdoms. And we have succeeded in doing that, but it requires constant vigilance and ministers to be on the case. And that means you've got to have ministers who know that this is a crucial part of what they do. And some ministers are very, very good at this. Others don't focus on it enough, and that's something that will need to change, I think, in the future.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Catherine, a view from the Institute for Government.
Thank you. And I mean, just to reiterate some of what Francis has just said, back when he started in the Cabinet Office in 2010 or soon thereafter, one of my colleagues, Jill Rutter, wrote a paper called Read Before Burning, just to, one of our favourite titles. But one of the things that we argued there was there was a complete lack of a consistent typology of even all of these bodies. So different departments had various different bodies. They weren't all necessarily the same thing, even when you put them in a particular bracket or whatever. So we have come a long way since then. But just to give a bit of context to this, I mean, in 2020, there were 295 public bodies. That was down from 800 in 2010, but actually down from 2,000 in 1979. So we've come a long way since then. And actually, if you look at the rate of declines amongst NNDPBs, which are the most numerous type of ALB, they were down 3% a year under Thatcher, 4% a year under Major, 3% a year again under New Labour, and it accelerated under you to 8% reduction a year. So we have seen a big shift, certainly since Francis was in, but the problem is that oftentimes the decline tends to focus on the sort of easier pickings, the less important bodies. So you get local boards and advisory committees in particular, which are probably some of the things that are easiest to create, but they're also easier, therefore, to get rid of. So of the about 500 bodies that were removed between 2010 and 2020, about 200 were prison and immigration centre monitoring boards or committees of justice or of the peace, of the peace. So you will get this kind of accumulation of different types of bodies that then can be sort of culled back. I'm not going to go again about the sort of the value of having these. You've already touched upon a lot of those. There are some quite important functions that you do actually want to keep separate from ministers. And there's an interesting question we can get into, which is actually, are there some aspects where you don't want ministerial responsibility because it's too distracting and it stops them getting on with far more important stuff? So when it's very routine kind of operations, do you really want them to do that? Just as a sort of a few points about the problems of reorganisation, though, because one of the issues is when we do reform these, you need to make sure that you do them properly. Some reforms can be subject to political whim, so just look at Public Health England. That was formed in 2012 to combine public health campaigns and preventative work alongside infectious disease control. That in itself caused lots of disruption to it. But obviously after coronavirus, there's been a huge question mark about Public Health England. So we've decided that that has failed, and instead now infectious disease and public health campaigns will be split again into a new health, in the new Health and Social Care Bill. So there are also costs in doing some of these. So when thinking about what Francis has talked about here, the way in which they should be best organised, also need to think through how much added cost are we going to add down the line if we don't get it right. There's also something about the kind of expertise and so forth that comes into, and I'll give you another recent example. So the British Business Bank, government had to set that up from scratch because they'd had previous versions, things like 3i, the Industrial and Commercial Finance Corporation, had been privatised in a further era. But the British Business Bank, when it, after its creation, turned out to be extremely useful during the coronavirus crisis because it was a way that the government could deliver the business loan schemes, the bounce backs loans, etc., which kept a lot of small businesses afloat. Now, the other side of that is that the types of experts who went to work in the British Business Bank were not the sort of people that you would get going into government, becoming civil servants and so forth. So there's an interesting question about the different kinds of people, not just at the chair and chief executive level, but elsewhere within them that would go to work. That said, reform is needed, and I think a particular message we should take is just the loss of momentum since 2015, since Francis left the Cabinet Office. But if you're thinking about saving monies, it's not necessarily just a complete cull. Actually, if you look at budgets and funding streams, it's not necessarily the number of bodies. Many of the regulators actually work at no cost to the taxpayer because they're funded by the industry that they regulate. It's about a quarter of them. 83% of government funding for ALBs goes to 3 bodies: NHS England, Education and Skills Funding Agency, and HMRC. So really the thing that you need to be focusing on is the efficiency of these bodies. And that is an area where there's still a lot of work that we can be doing. One of the problems is sponsorship functions in departments. They don't always work well because they don't attract good, the best quality civil servants into those jobs, and because then the turnover of those civil servants is very high. So you have these arm's length bodies, these quangos, who are much more experienced in the policy area because the people they're dealing with in the departments keep turning over all the time. So that causes a load of problems. But also, since 2015, the government has taken its eye off the ball. The triennial reviews that are supposed to happen, less than half of the bodies have been reviewed in the last 5 years. This was down from 76% of them in 2016. And as a recent NAO report says, the reviews are often focused far too narrowly just on governance issues. And are also not independent enough, and some of them are actually conducted by the same civil servants who manage the bodies from inside the departments. So there's a lot better that we can be doing in using this function to make sure that these bodies are being kept on the ball and so forth. So what to do? I mean, one thing that's already been touched upon is transparency. Compared to 2016, there's a much higher proportion of ALBs that publish minutes of their meetings, registers of interest for their board members, and details that the Ombudsman can appeal to. But fewer bodies are regulated by the Commissioner for Public Appointments. So you can focus on better appointments. You can focus a lot more on making sure that you get people with the right skills coming into it, a much greater diversity, as Francis has said. That involves opening up questions about paying. And I think George's article today is very interesting from that because it goes to the heart of this question. You want to pay more, perhaps even more than the Prime Minister, if you're going to get a really skilled person who's actually going to do a fantastic job. What we're all worried about is the idea that the pay just incrementally just goes up automatically without necessarily thinking through all of that. So, yeah, a lot more that we can be doing about reforming all of these, but it isn't just down to the pure numbers of them. A lot of it is just about the relationship to government and the way in which they're managed.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do a very quick fire follow-up with each panellist. George, you mentioned this idea of people doing multiple jobs at once. In your work, did you come across any that sort of seemed like conflicts of interest to you, or was it simply a function of too much time spent doing something else?
Well, I think there were a few cases that were interesting. The chair, to say the least, the director of Homes England, for example, has a side gig on the investment panel for residential property at a big French investment bank. The chair of the British Tourism Authority is a non-executive director of a luxury hotel chain, and the chief executive of the Atomic Energy Regulator has a non-exec directorship of a energy company. Now, I don't make any claim that this is, interfering with their work, but it is a bit cosy to have a job in the industry that you work in. And in terms of governance, it's just not a good idea sometimes to do that, because not only are you spending time, you should be working, on the job where these are very complex jobs, very important jobs, jobs where you need to deliver for the people who work for you and also the public you serve. You shouldn't be distracted by a second job if you're in that situation. I think, it's very different for non-executive directors, and, actually in the piece today, if you want to have a portfolio career, that's fine. There's not a problem with that. But the question becomes more around, how much value are you getting off from a very, very high non-exec director who's only there 2 or 3 days a week? To me, it just strikes me as, if you've got a limited executive budget, as Catherine says, should you not be trying to get someone who's a world expert in your area or very experienced as your chief exec, rather than somebody who just chairs a lot of boards as your chair? It does seem to be a bit of a lack of the correct priority for public service. But I think in terms of these sort of cases, it comes to a sort of more general point around governance. and the kind of people we appoint to these positions. You know, it needs to be transparent. You know, obviously you need people in there who are going to, you know, allow you to do your policy when they're delivery bodies. You can't have someone who's going to block it in the way that just doesn't work with the rest of the government. But at the same time, you know, you need, especially for regulatory bodies, just a much greater degree of transparency and a much greater degree of openness. I mean, again, as Francis was saying, sometimes people who are brilliant for these boards and these positions just don't know they exist. They don't know they could do them. And if you have the same people, I mean, we have examples of people, you know, who are members of 7 different quangos in government. Like, you do need for those non-executive positions people who have a different view of the world and aren't just chairing quangos for a living. So I think there's a lot more that can be done in both in terms of sort of transparency in general, making those positions, advertising procedures much easier for women and minorities. You know, people who maybe have kids, you know, who wouldn't otherwise be able to do it. There's a lot more things you could do about this.
Thank you very much. Nick, in a minute or less, if you can. Francis touched on the idea that there's this sort of almost like a merry-go-round of same people, groupthink, you know, people operating in these organisations. What about the sense that they're overtly political? Did you ever come across those kinds of challenges?
Well, this actually isn't an example from a quango, but I remember probably in the first year in the Home Office discovering that one of our officials had previously been a special advisor under Labour, and I remember Fiona and me, my colleague in the Home Office, going a little bit mental and thinking, God, what's he up to? And like his cards were marked, and within a few months of watching it, we realised he was one of the best officials going. And it is important to remember that that actually it is possible to do these jobs despite your misguided affiliation with social democracy or socialism. And you know, one day we will not be in power, and there will be Conservatives who have something to contribute. So I don't think we should be too paranoid about that. And I think it's an easy get out for us to sort of say, oh, it's because there are lefties under the bed or, you know, stuffed in this organisation or that. We've got to ask ourselves why organisations behave in the political ways that they do. Yes, there will be some individuals who maybe take it too far or see things through their own philosophical prism or whatever. But, you know, we have the levers. This is a Conservative government, there's a Conservative majority in Parliament. The legal frameworks that these organisations are abiding by are driving the behaviours of some of the organisations, driving their behaviours. And unless we're prepared to look at those things and change them, then we're just going to keep grumbling, but not very much will change.
Yeah, great point. Francis, again, very quickly, if you can. Were there examples of organisations that were set up, achieved their objective, but then started to find that they had a new mission, maybe, a bit of mission creep, a new reason to stay existing? And if so, what can be done what mechanisms can be used to mitigate against that?
Well, I think I haven't got any particular examples. I'm sure there are examples. But the way of militating against it, preventing it, is the triennial review and being done, Catherine says, it needs to be done properly, independently, rigorous, with not the people who are kind of dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. And just look at it. I mean, say, what are they actually, what is their remit? Is that now the right remit? And are they sticking with it, or are they doing more things? But I mean, that's, you know, that ministers need to be on the case.
Okay. And Catherine, last but not least, you talked about a sort of slowdown and the triennial review coming up against hurdles. Is that because the low-hanging fruit's already been picked?
I think it's partly that. I think it's also partly that Francis moved on from the Cabinet Office. But this is an important, you know, we've written recently about Steve Barclay moving over there. And you know, Michael Gove, he was a prominent, powerful minister to have at the Cabinet Office, but his brief was so massive, firstly dealing with Brexit, then dealing with coronavirus, that actually this kind of stuff ends up falling to somebody else. Now he's taken, big parts of the Cabinet Office, some parts of the Constitution brief, but obviously also the Levelling Up and, Union brief over to his new behemoth department. And that leaves a Cabinet Office which has still got a mixed bag of all sorts of bits and pieces in it, but a big part of that should be public service reform, working with the Treasury, which, Steve Barclay's got good experience with. So you would hope that he can actually turn his attention not just to this, but also civil service reform. And they are somewhat, related. And there are things that they do. I mean, they do have a test case if you're setting up a new ALB, which asks all the questions that Francis has mentioned. So they have the tools there to kind of be able to do this. It's just that you do have to keep up the momentum, or more important things just end up absorbing officials' time.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to open out for questions now. If you could wait for the mic to arrive, and then if you've got a question to direct at somebody, could you please say so in your question, this gentleman in the aisle.
Thank you very much. I'm beginning to wonder if the correct question is how effective is the quango state? Everybody seems to be saying to various degrees we need it, but I work in the private sector and every day, every hour we question what we're doing. Is it effective? And what strikes me listening to you all, there's a complete lack of management of the quango state rather than, there should be parameters, there should be measurement, there should be cost effectiveness, and that's what we should be focusing on. If the size of the quango state improved tenfold, but its effectiveness improved 100-fold, I'd be over the moon.
Okay, Francis, do you want to address that quickly?
Yeah, well, I mean, you're completely right, but that's not just quangos. That's the whole of the public sector. And we are very bad at management information. We brought in to government a whole lot of very senior people from the business world, principally from the business, not exclusively from this world, to be non-execs on ministries, the boards of departments. And the universal response from them is, I cannot believe how poor the management information is. And the tendency for the measures to change. We put in place, and it was a very, very painful process, a system of measuring the common areas of spend between ministries. And we published this thing romantically called the Quarterly Data Summary. But it took 2 years of painful work to get agreed definitions across central government departments, because every ministry would say, oh, well, what we do is completely different, unique and distinctive, and you can't possibly compare what we do with what they do. Well, yes, you can. But the very senior, experienced businessman I recruited to get this exercise done of the agreed definitions, he said to me one day, Francis, if you see a body floating down the Thames, that's going to be me, because the resistance I am getting, and that's because of the accountability. When you've got that kind of benchmarking, it creates accountability, and Whitehall does not like accountability.
Catherine, you want to...
Yeah, well, just briefly on that. I mean, one of the things that we don't do well enough is actually support those people working in arm's length bodies, just to be a bit sympathetic to them for a minute. There's two bodies called the Association of Chief Executives and the Public Chairs Forum, and they're both basically membership organisations for the chairs and chief executives, which focuses on things like how do we improve our management, how do we do, all these sorts of issues that we're talking about today. And they do talk about things like how they can get shared services between them all to try and, develop efficiencies there. But it's only recently that actually government's got round to supporting people coming into government, especially from different walks of life, private sector or whatever, to help them understand government so that they can do their job more effectively. And they've only recently got round to developing induction training, basically, for these non-executives who sit on the boards of these bodies. So there is a lot more that we could do to actually support them and help them be more effective, because I think in a lot of cases they probably agree with a lot of this and would want to be doing better for less.
Okay, thank you. There's a gentleman just there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel if you're at all concerned about the effective extension of patronage in public appointments, or whether you're happy to trust your government ministers to exercise that power with true objectivity and good judgment.
Nick, do you want to address that first?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you're a sort of power-crazed cabinet minister intent on driving everything through in the limited time you've got, you're going to want your trusted people. Whether that's necessarily right for the system when you sort of step back and look at it from the outside is a different question. I mean, to me, ministers are not supported nearly enough. I'm a former special advisor, a recovering special advisor, etc. I would abolish special advisors. The ministers should have like a proper cabinet around them with proper specific roles that they can appoint to. They need to be able to reach into their departments with a strong team at the centre who they know are like, you know, their futures are vested with their futures. And if you have that, there might be a little less temptation to, you know, stick your own guys into positions in a slightly inappropriate way. But in the end, you have one of the things about Whitehall that is like the recurring theme of Yes Minister and all the rest, is that the civil service is there forever, and you're there for these fleeting moments where you have a chance to do something. So there's this tension because you just want to go fast and they want to put the brakes on. For perfectly good reasons on both sides. So you want, you know, if you're coming across that resistance, you want to try to get people in who can make a difference. Whether that's, you know, the way Michael Gove used non-exec directors on his departmental boards. They weren't really non-executive; they were sort of auxiliary ministers, sort of pretty executive. You know, that's not really how that role was envisaged. In governance terms, you could criticise it, but in terms of the effectiveness that he had in the DFE, it was brilliant. So if the system worked better, you might actually get less of this sort of sticking people into positions where it's not quite in the rules. So I think my answer is that actually just the system needs to work better.
George?
Well, I think, you know, there is a big problem with transparency that has got worse in this government. As anyone who follows me on Twitter knows that I rant about the problems of the Freedom of Information Act currently going on. And I think there's a big part of this that usually sunshine is the best policy. That actually I don't think people really mind. If you are bringing someone in to do a specific job, you know, they pass vetting, they pass, you know, the correct procedures. If they're being brought in to do the job, that's fine. As long as, you know, all those processes are correct. And the problem is, you know, particularly in the last couple of years, we do have a problem with, you know, this allegations of cronyism. And I think it isn't good either for the function of the quango state or the perception of it. And these are reasonably easy fixes. You know, often, you know, a perception isn't reality. But if you're just whiter than white, as transparent as possible, not only do you bring in, you know, attract these roles people who actually you may not have thought of being very good at them, but actually are brilliant. But also, you know, you diffuse those arguments from you know, political opponents. You know, you can say, here you go, here's the minutes of the meeting we decided them. You know, here is the vetting we did. You know, here's their CV. And you want to see the emails? Oh, here they are. You know, it just seems like that seems to be the best approach with this stuff.
Okay.
I mean, look, I mean, I think we shouldn't get too fussed about this, frankly. The Public Appointments Commissioner puts in place processes, and for important quango governance roles, they are, people have to go through a process of being decided whether properly assessed whether they are appointable. And the change we got made and we insisted on is that that process, what the panel does, is not to choose the individual, but to submit to the minister, because these are ministerial appointments, a list of people who are appointable, who have met the kind of test of are they up to the job and are they appropriate for the job. And then ministers should be able to decide. And I appointed people to important quangos, important public bodies, and you have an open process, but sometimes I had a candidate in mind who I thought was the right person, and if someone else had come through who was better, very happy to appoint them. But the idea that you can just sort of randomly appoint someone who's your mate is for the birds. That doesn't happen. It can't happen.
All right. Two interesting gentlemen in the aisle there. Oh, sorry. Bit of a...
Thank you very much. Just a question about accountability for some of these organisations. And we've mentioned the regulators and how there's a number of regulators like the General Medical Council, the healthcare regulators, that have to be independent of government. But at the same time, these are bodies that can have a profound impact on people's lives. They can reach into the life of a doctor, a dentist, and end their career. So how do we make those bodies more accountable without creating another quango to oversee them, really? That's the question.
Catherine, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, look, you do need some separation. Things like, you've mentioned some of them, but also CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority. You don't want, politicians to be making decisions about mergers. You've got the dangers of how political pressures can distort decisions, and I think, therefore, it is important to have some kind of separation. Of course, then you also need some kind of ministerial accountability. I mean, it's the age-old saying of, I think it was Ernie Bevan about the...
Clatter of the bedpan.
Clatter of the bedpans. I can't remember which hospital it was in. I was reaching for it, but would be heard still effectively in his office. It will still, and actually the example of the border agency is a really good one, because it will still matter to a department if something really falls over. The difficulty of this we're seeing at the moment around changes in the elections bill around the Electoral Commission, where you've got a body which obviously, effectively regulates how politicians get into power. We're now going to have a policy statement which is produced by parliaments. Now, on one level, you can say, well, that's bringing it in line with all other arm's length bodies, quite right for Parliament to have a say over how elections are run in this country and so forth. On the other hand, it then leaves you open to the possibility of a government sort of abusing that position and gearing the Electoral Commission in particular ways of their work. So there's arguments either way. It's always going to be the problem that how do you create ombudsmen for the people at the very top of the organisations of government. So it's not necessarily something that you can just solve through one perfect model.
Okay, we've got time for two more questions, I think. This chap in the front row, thank you.
I have one for Nick. I really agree with what you were saying about these sort of new Labour legal frameworks sort of drive the culture of departments. So why is it that the Johnson government, the May government, why don't they sort of repeal the Equality Act or the HRA? Is there indifference towards it? Is there media pressure? Is there political advisors saying... Are there political advisors that say it wouldn't be a good idea? Why isn't progress made on it? If people like yourself think it's sort of in the way.
Well, the answer is, I think, quite a lot of things. I mean, it's not simple. The Human Rights Act issue is actually bound up with the way in which the European Convention on Human Rights works and how the European Court in Strasbourg works. And there is an argument about whether you can deal with the worst of the worst cases caused by the Human Rights Act without withdrawing from the ECHR, or whether actually that would be sort of tinkering or window dressing. And the idea of withdrawing from the ECHR is pretty complicated. And I think, in fact, Britain's membership of the ECHR is confirmed in the withdrawal agreement with the European Union. So it's complicated. I think it's also the case that, and this is changing, lots of Conservative politicians, and I think lots of Conservatives actually find the idea of any issues that could be that could come under the title of the culture war just a bit icky. They don't really want to touch it. They sort of didn't come into politics to fight these kinds of battles. They wanted to make the economy more efficient, maybe sort of run public services better. They think it's just a little bit dirty. And it's quite easy to look mean. It's certainly how you'd be caricatured by your opponents. I remember in the Home Office we had responsibility for equalities at some point, and I remember having provisional agreement with Number 10 to announce at conference. Our announcement at conference was going to be that we were going to abolish the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I was very much in favour of this. And in the end we were told we couldn't do it, and the explanation from Number 10 was we just didn't think it would be a good look for a Conservative minister to stand up and announce that we're abolishing the idea of equality. It sounds silly, but actually there's a kind of an emotional side to it. And look, no Conservative leader so far has a mandate to do it either. Nobody's said this is what we need to do. And with the absolutely seismic things that the government has been dealing with, this might feel like a sort of not even a secondary, but maybe like a tertiary order issue. But I think at some point we're going to have the conversation.
Okay, final question. This gentleman then on the aisle. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. My name's Neil Mendoza, and like Nick, I confess to being a quangocrat. And one of the things that I was interested in, actually, and I also sit on appointment panels, and I've also conducted one of your triennial reviews, Francis. I've had to ask the British Museum director and chair at the same time whether they needed to exist or whether their organisation needs to exist. You can imagine how well that went down. I'm interested in Catherine's typology, because I wonder if a way forward into all this is not to look at the entire quango state, but to try and divide it up and look at the things that are more important or that could be attacked and looked at in one way. I mean, you identify the NHS is quite a big quango. That would be quite a serious one to take on, and there are others that are smaller. But rather than just going for the low-hanging fruit, could we do a typology by importance, by their legal agreements, as Nick suggested, and by something so that we could try and see whether we could make an impact on some of the more urgent and pressing issues around this particular sector?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think the other thing to remember is that this affects particular policy areas more than others. MOJ is pretty much a department for dealing with large quangos, whereas the Foreign Office is not really an issue so much. So one of the things we think about in terms of ministerial training is how much they understand the role that arm's length bodies will play, the way in which to manage them effectively, how to keep on the department to make sure they're doing that effectively, and so forth. So, yeah, I think you could take it a bit more. And I mean, the trouble is, it's one of these perennial issues where, it's departments that are responsible for them, and then the Cabinet Office that has this kind of role overseeing the whole system, along with Treasury, who are the ones that actually do the whole should you exist, or especially if you're wanting to set up a new one, they're the ones with the questionnaire about, do you really need this? Are you sure? Are you really, really sure? So I think there's a lot more that we could do to look at which policy areas are these most appropriate for, why we want them to be arm's length, what that means for the relationship to department, to the minister, and so forth. And also thinking about how they're managed well with that sort of departmental and central relationship.
Okay, thank you very much.
And we will be doing future work on all of these things. So,
nice plug.
Keep watching.
Just how big is the quango state? I'm not necessarily sure we answered the question specifically, but it provided an excellent framework for what I think you'll agree were some fascinating insights from a range of perspectives. So, Catherine, Francis, Nick and George, thank you all very much.